This photograph was taken in 1889 in a cramped studio on Kirkgate in the industrial city of Leeds, England. The subject is Arthur Isaac Whitfield, an 8-day-old infant. And what you're looking at here is just one of 52 nearly identical images of the same child taken over the course of only 6 months. Look carefully at this image. At first glance, it fits neatly into the Victorian world of stiff portraits and formal poses, but the longer you stare, the more it begins to resist that comfort. The eyes are closed, as they are in every single image in this sequence, but the eyelids look heavy, waxen, almost ancient, with none of the softness of ordinary sleep. The posture is wrong. The tiny body is too rigid. The head is held at an unnatural angle, supported by something hidden just out of frame. The limbs don't fall where gravity would place them. They've been arranged with a kind of calculated precision, as if they needed to be propped rather than simply laid down. The expression is wrong. The small mouth hangs half open, lips slack, in a way that doesn't belong on a living child's face. And around this stillness, everything else is overflowing with life. The bright lace, the cushions blooming with pattern, carefully arranged flowers. Yet at the center, something is fundamentally wrong. What you are seeing here is not a single tragic portrait. It is one frame in a series that, according to physicians and officials involved, defied everything Victorian doctors thought they knew about death, decomposition, and grief. Even now, more than 130 years later, the full sequence cannot be explained in any simple medical way. The timing, the apparent condition of the body, the behavior of the child's mother. And there is a part of it that perhaps can never truly be understood because it sits precisely on the border between psychiatric illness, religious belief, and something darker. This is not just a sad Victorian story. It may be the most disturbing mourning ritual of the 19th century. A mother, a corpse, a camera, and half a year of denial, pursued in full view of neighbors, police, and asylum doctors. It is a case that goes far beyond any ordinary entry in a medical textbook. It questions the very limits of reality. Where does grief end and madness begin? And at what point does reality itself start to bend under the weight of refusal? In this episode of Veins of Darkness, we'll follow the trail from this single photograph through coroner's records, parish burial registers, asylum casebooks, and the ledgers of a Victorian studio to uncover what happened when one mother simply refused to bury her child. More than 130 years later, it still cannot be explained in any simple way. To understand why this baby was photographed 52 times after his death, we have to go back into the soot-choked streets and locked hospital wards of the winter of 1889. It is the last winter of the 1880s. In London, the echo of the Jack the Ripper murders still hangs in the newspapers. Stories of women cut down in alleys, of a city unable to protect its most vulnerable. Across Britain, the press is full of violence, epidemic disease, and a rising sense that the modern world is more dangerous than anyone had imagined. 200 miles to the north, in Leeds, the industrial heart of Victorian England, beats loudly. Textile mills line the River Aire, their tall chimneys belching smoke that settles in a greasy film on brick and skin alike. Work whistles cut the days into rigid segments. tenement housing presses up against factory walls. Whole families crowd into 2 small rooms on a single floor. Off Kirkgate, one of the city's main streets, the lanes are narrow and damp. Wet cobblestones shine black with coal dust. Laundry sags between red brick terraces. The bitter tang of smoke mixes with the sweeter smells of horse manure, spilled beer, and refuse piled in the gutters. Church bells mark Sundays, but so do the small, slow funeral carriages. Infant funerals are ordinary business here. Tiny black-painted carts, short white coffins, grieving parents walking behind with shoulders already bent from labor. Medicine is changing, but slowly. Germ theory has begun to convince younger doctors that invisible organisms can cause disease. They can name bronchitis, pneumonia, typhoid. But naming something is not the same as curing it. Antibiotics are half a century away. Mental illness, meanwhile, is barely understood at all. There is no concept of postpartum psychosis, no careful vocabulary of depression and trauma. There is only a shadowy cluster of labels: melancholia, moral derangement, puerperal insanity. Women who falter after childbirth are described in casebooks as broken, wandering, or incoherent, and they are often removed from their homes with little hope of return. Psychiatrists, as they are, experiment with crude treatments: cold baths to shock the nerves, mechanical restraints that pin arms and legs to iron beds, isolation in stone cells, dimly lit, doses of opium or bromides to quiet agitation. There are theories of exhausted nerves and disordered wombs, but no real understanding of trauma or grief. On the outskirts of Leeds, the landscape suddenly rises into a wall of stone: the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum. A high central tower watches over long, echoing wings. Rows of tall arched windows break up blank brick walls. The chimneys look like additional watchtowers, constantly smoking from the kitchens and laundry below. Iron gates guard the entrance. Beyond them, fields and gardens where patients are put to work under the motto of therapeutic labor. Inside, the wards are crowded, especially the female ones. Some patients wear straitjackets. Some wander barefoot in gowns, muttering, hair unkempt. Among the staff, there are whispered stories of women who came in after losing a baby and never saw the outside world again. Today, if a woman after childbirth began to insist that her dead child was alive, if she kept the body at home, dressed it, photographed it, and tried to care for it, most clinicians would recognize a severe postpartum psychosis combined with profound, complicated grief. Medication, close supervision, and therapy could interrupt the spiral. But in 1889, doctors and priests operating in this world simply did not possess the tools, scientifically, socially, or morally, to handle such a case. Into this world of coal smoke and shallow graves and brutal asylums, Arthur Whitfield was born and died, and somehow kept returning to the camera. To understand why, we have to begin with the 2 people who wanted him most.
In the 1881 census, a young woman appears in the records of Leeds, Margaret Ellis, daughter of a weaver. Her occupation is listed simply as seamstress. It is a kind of work that leaves the back twisted and the eyes strained. Long days bent over cloth by candlelight, hands raw from needles and thread. A few streets away, in a lodging house, the same census lists Isaac James Whitfield, a commercial clerk employed in the textile trade. He is literate, trusted to keep accounts, but still working class. His days are spent at a desk, recording the movements of goods and money through the mills. In January of 1888, the parish register for St. Mary's Church records their marriage. 2 signatures, side by side, Isaac J. Whitfield and Margaret Ellis. In the margin, the clerk notes that the groom is a clerk, the bride, still, a dressmaker. Their lives, small in the eyes of the city, are enormous to them. They take a modest 2-room terraced house off Kirkgate. The front room looks straight onto the street, curtains always a little sooty from the air. Behind it, a cramped kitchen and scullery. A tiny yard holds a coal shed and little else. By day, Margaret takes in sewing. The rhythmic thump of the treadle sewing machine becomes part of the soundtrack of the street. Shirts, skirts, children's dresses. She turns cloth into clothing that will go out into the city and disappear on strangers' backs. Every morning, Isaac walks past a row of shop fronts toward the commercial district. Grocers, pawnbrokers, taverns, and on Kirkgate, one doorway marked with an elegant painted sign, J. Caldwell, photographic artist, from life and death. Behind that door, gas lamps and a glass roof illuminate backdrops, props, and the heavy camera that will later record his son. To neighbors, the Whitfields are simply another respectable church-going couple. They attend services. Margaret brings mended lace for the altar linens. Nothing about them suggests what is to come. Privately, there is already a kind of quiet sorrow. Later medical writing hints that before Arthur, Margaret may have suffered a miscarriage of some months' gestation. In the language of the time, she is said to be delicate and susceptible to low spirits. But she functions, cooks, sews, attends church. She is not yet broken. On the 1st of December, 1889, after hours of labor in the little bedroom above the street, Margaret delivers a son. The midwife notes in her record, male child, Arthur Isaac, fine boy, good color, strong cry. For a few days their house holds something like ordinary happiness. Ellen, Margaret's younger sister, writes in a later letter that, for 1 week, she shone with joy I have never seen in her before. Margaret stitches tiny shirts with neat rows of blue thread. Isaac comes home early from the office just to watch the baby sleep. The cradle, borrowed from a neighbor, is pulled close to the bedroom window to catch what little light the Leeds winter allows. And then, 8 days after he is born, everything changes. The 8th of December, 1889, is damp and cold. Soot clings low in the flog, turning the daylight into a grayish smear. Sometime in the morning, Arthur begins to wheeze. His tiny chest draws in with visible effort. The soft skin between his ribs dips alarmingly at each breath. His nose flares, his lips take on a faint bluish tinge. Margaret, inexperienced and exhausted, does what countless mothers in that era did. She wraps him tighter and waits, hoping it will pass. By afternoon, his breathing has worsened. A local doctor, summoned from his rounds, examines the infant. He listens to the rattling in his lungs, sees the effort of each breath, and writes down a diagnosis familiar to every Victorian practitioner: acute bronchitis. There is, in reality, little he can offer. He suggests keeping the room warm but the air fresh, perhaps a mustard poultice to the chest, a few drops of laudanum for the mother. By evening, Arthur is dead. The doctor returns to sign the death certificate. On the printed form, in ink that has faded to brown, someone pens, cause of death, acute bronchitis, age, 8 days. Below that, Informant, Isaac J. Whitfield, Father. There is no space on the form to record Margaret's condition, and so it goes unmentioned. In that neighborhood and in that era, there is a clear script for what should happen next. Women often helped lay out their own dead infants. With help from a sister or neighbor, they would wash the small body, close the eyes and mouth, and wrap it in a clean cloth and lay it in a coffin or basket. Undertakers were summoned within a day. Funeral notices went out. Within 2 days, 3 at most, the child would be in the ground. Margaret breaks that script almost at once. She does wash Arthur. She does dress him in the best gown she has sewn, a simple white garment with tiny tucks along the hem. She lays him in the cradle, but she does not call the undertaker. When Ellen comes to the house, she later writes that M. would not let him from her arms, saying only, "He is very tired, he must sleep." She is holding him not in the way a mother holds a sick child, but the way a mother holds something she cannot admit has already slipped away.
So, on or around the 10th of December, Isaac and Margaret carry Arthur, already dead, through the narrow streets to J. Caldwell's studio on Kirkgate. For Isaac, and perhaps for everyone else present, this is a single, sorrowful appointment, one last image to hold in a pocketbook or place on the mantel. But for Margaret, something different happens. She sees her son, who is now no longer moving, rendered in a form that does not change. In the dim glow of the studio, on a polished card, his face is fixed, eyes closed, yes, but features soft, unspoiled, unharmed by the hours that have passed. She has found a way to freeze him in time. In the days after a funeral should have taken place, Margaret keeps Arthur in the house. The cradle stays by the bedroom window. The fire in the grate is kept low. When Ellen asks why the room is so cold, Margaret explains that it keeps him cooler, so he rests better. She begins to sew more outfits, tiny gowns, little jackets, caps with embroidered edges. They are not folded and put away for another child. They are not sent to charity. Each one is held up against Arthur's still form, measured, adjusted. And in the ledger at Caldwell's studio, a clerk begins to write a line that will repeat itself over and over as December becomes January. Mrs. M. Whitfield, infant, special sitting. What starts as one final photograph becomes, for Margaret, a kind of doorway. In the weeks that followed, her transformation became impossible to ignore. Ellen's letters from January paint a picture that at first looks like intense but understandable mourning. She writes that Margaret is living for nothing but the babe, that she will not come down to meals, that she sleeps only in brief snatches beside the cradle. She speaks to Arthur in the present tense. "Your father is at work. Your Aunt Ellen has come to see you. We shall go out when the weather is finer." At night, neighbors hear her voice through the thin walls, humming lullabies, sometimes weeping, sometimes talking as if answering imagined questions. Then something shifts. Margaret begins to quote from mourning manuals and funeral advertisements, which she must have collected from newspapers or borrowed pamphlets. She tells Ellen that it is perfectly safe to keep an infant's remains some days in winter if the room is kept cool, and that some mothers cannot bear to be parted until the last possible hour. She corrects others on how long a little one's form can be preserved without visible decay, her tone oddly authoritative, sounding less like a grieving mother and more like someone in the funeral trade. Caldwell's daybooks show that she is putting this knowledge into practice. Throughout January and February, the book records visits from Mrs. Whitfield, infant, At first, the entries are neutral. Then, in late January, one is annotated Mrs. W., infant, deceased, difficult sitting. In early February, Mrs. Whitfield, child, post-mortem, mother insists child improves. Every visit requires dressing the body and carrying it through public streets. Once is normal, even if morbid. Twice is unusual. 3, 4, 5 times becomes something else. By now, the house itself had begun to change. A sanitary inspector, in a report written months later, notes that multiple neighbors complained of a sweet, sickly odor emanating from the Whitfields' home for weeks on end. They also speak of hearing soft singing at hours when most of the street is asleep. One neighbor, interviewed decades later in an oral history project, recalled that cats refused to go upstairs in that house. They would sit on the bottom step and cry, but would not go further, always stopping at the threshold of the baby's room. Whether genuine memory or embroidered legend, it speaks to a shared sense that death was no longer confined to the cemetery. It had taken up residence on Kirkgate. When Dr. H.B., the physician who will later publish an anonymized account of the case, first visits Margaret, he is struck by a detail that shows how far she had traveled from ordinary grief. He expects tears, disorientation, perhaps denial. Instead, she greets him calmly. She speaks in measured tones about Arthur's coloring, about the stiffness of his limbs, about the smell that comes and goes. She notes that in this cold he keeps better, and that when she warms his hands, they become too soft again. He writes in his case report that her sorrow seems ordered, ritualized, and sustained far beyond the natural bounds. What disturbed him more than her words were the photographs. Laid out in chronological order on Caldwell's work table, the glass plates and prints show a child who ought to be changing. Modern forensic pathology tells us what should happen to an untreated infant's body over time. Within hours, a waxy pallor. Within days, marbling of the skin, a shift in color. Then swelling. Then, over weeks, the collapse of features as tissues break down. Yet, in the sequence of photographs from December through March, Arthur's face looks eerily consistent. There are small differences, a tighter look around the mouth in one, a slightly more sunken eye socket in another, but there is nothing like the progression of corruption that the calendar dates would suggest. In early March of 1890, the sanitary inspector, acting on neighbor complaints, arrives at the Whitfields' front door with a policeman. When Margaret refuses to let them in, they force the issue. Upstairs, they find the cradle by the window, as before. The fire in the grate is cold. The curtains are slightly open, admitting a pale light. The air in the room is shockingly cool, almost like the outdoors. Arthur lies in the cradle, dressed in a fresh gown. The inspector notes in his report that the body is clearly that of an infant, evidently deceased some considerable time. He smells what he calls a characteristic odor, partially masked by flowers that Margaret has arranged around the pillow. He describes the mother as much agitated, repeatedly denying said death. This should have been the moment when the law stepped in decisively. By this point, Arthur has been dead for nearly 3 months. But even here, the system hesitates. The inspector reports to the coroner. The coroner advises burial without further delay and recommends a medical examination of Margaret's state of mind. No one, yet, forces the burial. Parish records show the most damning fact. Arthur dies on the 8th of December, 1889. He is not buried until the 24th of May, 1890. A gap of more than 6 months. Next to his burial entry, the curate has scribbled a rare, uneasy note. Body received in advanced state. Delay explained as maternal difficulties. Even in an age when infant death was common, this case troubled a man whose days were filled with funerals. In our own time, modern researchers have taken a closer look at the photographs themselves. High-resolution scans of early and late plates show a subtle but telling shift. In the December and January images, the texture of Arthur's skin is faintly visible. Light scatters in the way it does from human tissue, slightly diffused with tiny variations. In some of the plates dated April and May, that changes. The skin seems smoother, almost too perfect. Light glances off the cheeks in a way more consistent with wax than flesh. In certain close-ups, the edge of the ear looks opaque, where we would expect a newborn's to be delicately translucent. This has led to the most unsettling possibility in the entire case, that at some point, perhaps while Arthur's body spent a brief period at the hospital mortuary, it was used as the basis for a wax effigy. In later years, wax modelers in Leeds advertised the service of making life and death likenesses, often for medical schools or wealthy families who wanted memorial figures. One such modeler worked not far from the general infirmary. If, as some evidence suggests, a wax baby with human hair later sat under a glass dome in the Whitfield's parlor, then we may be looking at two phases in the photograph sequence: early images of a real corpse and later ones of a disturbingly faithful effigy dressed in the dead child's clothes. A modern pathologist asked to comment can stretch biology to explain a little. A cold room, minimal handling, perhaps some primitive use of preserving agents. These things can slow visible decomposition. They cannot, on their own, explain a 6-month delay between death and burial, combined with photographs that show almost no expected breakdown. Each element, the number of sessions, the delay in burial, the ambiguous condition of the body or effigy, makes the case more impossible than the last. By the time winter loosened its grip on Leeds, Margaret's mourning had become a quiet defiance of both law and biology. And those closest to her could no longer pretend it was just grief. Under that weight of defiance, the people closest to Margaret begin to look for help beyond the medical and the municipal. As neighbors' whispers turn sharper, Isaac and Ellen go to see the curate of St. Mary's, the same church whose register holds Arthur's birth and death. They describe, as best they can, what is happening in the little house off Kirkgate. The baby's continued presence, the sewing, the photographs, the smell. The curate is skeptical at first. He has seen all manner of mourning customs, hair woven into rings, rooms kept as shrines to the dead for years, mothers refusing to remove a child's toys. But this is different enough that he agrees to visit. On his first pastoral call, he climbs the narrow stairs to the front bedroom and finds Margaret exactly where the inspector did, seated by the cradle, needle in hand, working on yet another tiny garment. Arthur lies beside her, dressed and posed. To the curate's eyes, he is more doll than child now, a small form unnaturally still. Gently, he begins to talk about God's mercy, about laying the child in God's keeping in consecrated ground, about the comfort that can come from trusting that the soul has gone ahead, as indeed the body returns to dust. Margaret interrupts him.
"He is already in God's keeping," she says, without looking up from her stitching. "Here." The curate later writes, in a letter to a colleague, that her theological language is precise. She quotes scripture about resurrection. Ezekiel's valley of dry bones, the widow of Nain's son. She speaks of God's breath entering lifeless flesh. She insists that if God could restore those, he could just as easily breathe again into his nostrils, meaning Arthur's. Over several visits, the curate offers prayers. He reads psalms for the dead. He suggests, with increasing firmness, that clinging to the body might be hindering both her own healing and the child's peace. Margaret refuses every suggestion of burial as a betrayal of faith. Some parishioners, hearing fragments of the story, begin to whisper about demonic influence or possession. The curate, steeped in a more rational Anglican tradition, does not see demons. What he sees is a mind that has broken on the wheel of loss. Eventually, he writes to the family doctor, admitting in weary script that no rite of the church can reach her while she clings to the body with such ferocity. The responsibility shifts to the physicians. Dr. H.B., already concerned by the inspector's report and his own earlier visit, feels both professional curiosity and a sense of duty. He is interested in what he and his colleagues call puerperal insanity, disorders appearing after childbirth. He is familiar with European writings on the subject, but he has never seen a case like this. Called again after the coroner's warning, he enters the Whitfield's bedroom in the spring of 1890 and sees Arthur still lying in the cradle. By now, the body, or the effigy if the wax theory is correct, has been dressed and undressed, carried and posed for months. Margaret shows no awareness that this is remarkable. He observes her placing drops of milk on the baby's lips, then wiping them away with a cloth, as if feeding him. She fusses over a crease in his gown. She talks to him about the next photograph, telling him that Papa will see how nicely you are coming along. H.B. notes Isaac's presence as well, a man standing near the door, not approaching the cradle, hands clenched. When the doctor later speaks to him alone, Isaac admits that he is revolted by the body, but that any attempt to remove it leads to screams and fits so dreadful in his wife that he cannot face them. In his 1891 journal article, H.B. will anonymize the case, referring only to a woman of 29 married to a clerk residing in a northern manufacturing town. But the details are indistinguishable. He writes of a mother who, for months, retained a deceased infant, dressing it, photographing it, and interpreting every change of corruption as improvement. He calls it puerperal melancholia verging on mania. And then he writes a sentence that reveals how deeply her perception had fractured. She declares that in each new portrait the child looks stronger, that in the likeness taken at Easter his cheeks are more full, and that in the last photograph he is almost ready to open his eyes. To her, the camera is not recording the unchanging stillness of death, it is evidence of progress. All of these forces, neighbor complaints, clerical concern, a mounting medical dossier, converge finally on a date. The burial is set for 24 May 1890. The small coffin is ordered. The grave is prepared in the crowded churchyard. The morning is overcast, with a chill wind that cuts down the street despite the calendar. Undertakers arrive at the Whitfield's door, carrying the little coffin. Neighbors watch from behind curtains and cracked doors, knowing more than they say. When the men try to lift Arthur from the cradle and place him in the box, Margaret breaks. Witnesses describe her screaming, clinging to the child, shouting that they're trying to smother him in the dark. It takes multiple people to prise her fingers away. At the church, as the coffin is set beside the open grave and the curate begins the committal, Margaret snatches up a brass candlestick and strikes him across the head, crying that he is burying my son alive. The blow is not fatal, but symbolically it is decisive. The outburst, witnessed by parishioners and recorded in the curate's own notes, leaves no room for further hesitation. The law, which had tolerated her private rituals for months, now moves swiftly. Within days, legal papers are drawn up. Isaac, exhausted and ashamed, signs the forms authorizing his wife's removal under the terms of the Lunacy Acts. A few weeks after Arthur finally goes into the ground, a horse-drawn carriage rattles out of Leeds, carrying Margaret toward the high walls of the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum. For the first time in nearly half a year, the house on Kirkgate is without Arthur's body. But the photographs, and if the probate record is to be believed, a certain wax infant under glass remain.
But for Margaret, the real haunting was just beginning, behind the walls of the asylum. The road to the asylum winds past fields and farm buildings, then abruptly meets the high stone perimeter wall. The carriage passes through iron gates and into a world designed to contain distress. Inside, the complex is almost a town in its own right. Over 600 patients are housed here, divided into long wards, male and female, quiet and disturbed, recent and chronic. On admission, Margaret is taken to a room where a clerk asks questions and a doctor performs a brief examination. Her file is already thick, stuffed with letters from the curate, the coroner's note, and HB's preliminary report. When Dr. Edwin Cartwright, the chief physician, looks up from the bundle of papers at the woman in front of him, he sees someone whose distress has been simmering for months. When he asks her name, she gives it clearly enough. When he asks why she is here, she replies, "Because they have taken my child to the cold earth and left him alone." Pressed gently, she speaks only of Arthur, where he is buried, whether the grave is deep enough to be safe from damp, whether the coffin was left open or shut. She insists he must not be alone and that she should be allowed to sit with him. Cartwright has seen postpartum cases before. Women who develop delusions that their babies are demons, or that they have killed them, or that the world is ending. He orders that Margaret be placed initially in a female ward with others suffering what the casebooks call puerperal conditions. In that ward, there are several women who have lost infants. Some rock themselves and weep. Some stare blankly. Some talk to people who are not there. Margaret fits, and yet she does not. She lies quietly for hours, then suddenly sits up, arms cradling an invisible weight, humming the same few lullaby phrases over and over. The tune is soft, but insistent. Other women begin, tentatively, to hum along. Nurses notice a pattern. New admissions, women who arrive withdrawn but quiet, after a few days near Margaret, start to repeat her phrases. They speak of babies sleeping too long, or waiting to wake when God allows. They stand at the ward's high windows in the evenings, staring in the rough direction of the cemetery that lies somewhere beyond the asylum grounds. To our modern understanding, this is psychological contagion. Human beings absorbing each other's language and posture, grief calling to grief. To the overworked attendants and the less educated staff, it begins to look like something in her is spreading. Several attendants request reassignment. In their written reasons, they mention nightmares of crying infants, of tiny hands pulling at their sleeves. They describe a creeping dread whenever they approach Margaret's bed, as if they are about to disturb someone's vigil. A junior doctor writes in her casebook that her presence seems to keep grief keen in others, like an unhealed wound the ward cannot forget. Mental illness, in a setting like this, does not exist in a vacuum. It shapes the behavior of everyone around it.
Trying to preserve some semblance of order, the physicians make a decision. Margaret is moved from the shared ward to a single room in the east wing, an isolation cell in all but name. It contains an iron bed, a small wooden chair, and a barred window that looks out over a patch of worn grass, and beyond that, a blank wall.